Now, Dr. Hamburg has a great, most of you know her as the FDA commissioner. She was also the New York City Health Commissioner. And, you know, growing up in New York City, as Humphrey Bogart says in Casablanca, if you can make it in New York, you can kind of make it most of anywhere. And the kind of training one gets in the kind of politics of New York prepares you well for the politics of Washington. And she was a very distinguished FDA commissioner, and is now the Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Medicine. So again, I know I could go on for half hour with all the background that they have, but the point of today's meeting is for them to have a dialogue with you, and then obviously we invite you in this informal setting to kind of go at it. They are both very quick on their feet, as you know, and I know they'll really enjoy the exchange with you. So with that, Peggy and Mitchell, come forth, please.
Thank you, Ralph. I was wondering which side Peggy would choose to sit on.
I don't normally go to the right, but...
This is meant to be informal. Nice to see many of you. This is meant to be informal. Peggy and I know each other for a long time. We did our residencies together in medicine at Weill Cornell, which was then just Cornell, and this was then just Penn Medicine, and not Perelman and Weill. We've been friends and colleagues since. We serve on the Commonwealth Fund board together, which is a fun way to have spent more time recently. I will tell one little story which has nothing to do with anything other than it is the result of Peggy and I knowing each other. Through Peggy, I met her father. This is back in 1982, 83, right, more or less. David Hamburg, who many of you may know is quite a distinguished scholar and leader and policy leader and in many areas. I said to Peggy one day, you know, a couple of residency friends of mine and I were going skiing, and we just thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we went and visited East Germany, which was still East Germany then, and sort of researched or looked into what was going on in their healthcare delivery system. So through Peggy's father, who had a variety of affiliations that were relevant, that trip was arranged. Someday I'll tell some of you in private some of the things that happened on that trip. Because truthfully, all we were trying to do was have some extra fun on our ski trip. But we did, in fact, have some fascinating times touring what is no longer in existence, but part of the Soviet Union's sort of communist approach to the healthcare delivery, and that stuck with me for a long time. I'm gonna ask Peggy some questions. We've talked about these questions. We may or may not go in the order that we talked about. We will take questions from the audience, comments, et cetera. Don't be bashful. I know enough of you in the room that I know that you won't be. But the idea here and the idea of this lectureship or professorship, visiting professorship, is to expose the Penn community and surrounding community to physician leaders who have taken paths in their professional lives that are a little bit different, let's say, than the traditional path of research, patient care, and teaching. Not to say that the people who've been the lecturer or professor here haven't had those other roles in their professional lives, but that the direction of their professional life was entrepreneurial, in a sense. Sometimes so entrepreneurial in a literal sense that we've had healthcare business leaders here who are physicians. And oftentimes we've had healthcare leaders here who are physicians who are in the policy domain, as Peggy has significantly been. So we'll talk a little bit about Peggy's path. And maybe I'll start, Peggy, by asking you, what did you want to do when you were a little girl?
Well, what I used to say when people would ask me that when I was really young was saying I wanted to be an obstetrician. And it was partly because they would then be surprised that I knew such a big word. But I actually did want to be an obstetrician for a while. I grew up actually on the Stanford campus. My parents were both on the faculty at Stanford Medical School, so I was the daughter of 2 physicians, and knew a lot of doctors or people in biomedically related fields. So, you know, I did kind of think either you were a doctor or someone in science, or you were a garbage man or something, I don't know. I did have this very sort of distorted worldview, but then I went to college and I discovered there were lots of other things you could do. So I thought for a while about doing journalism, actually, because I worked on the school newspaper and it seemed very exciting. My father, in retrospect, says that was the period when I was drifting. But then I kept coming back to health and thinking about, you know, ways to work on health-related issues. And actually then I took a semester off and worked at the World Health Organization as an undergrad, mainly because I wanted to be in a country where I thought I could really work on my French. Little did I know that in Geneva, and especially the World Health Organization, nobody speaks French. It's all English, so it didn't help my French at all, but it did help me make the decision to, in fact, go to medical school, because it's a very hierarchical place, WHO, and I was hired to work on a cross-cultural study of depression. It was actually the first major study in that area that WHO was undertaking. But because I had no degree whatsoever in this very hierarchical place that also had a secretarial pool system, basically complete strangers would come up to me and give me things to type. It was way before word processing, and I'd never taken typing because I didn't want to be a secretary. But I was doing things in triplicate with the pink one going here and the green one going there. And yes, and oh my God. And I could see, you know, that if you wanted to really have a voice and a place at the table, getting that medical degree mattered. So then I went back and finished my pre-med courses and went on to do medicine, thinking though that I wanted to do academic medicine until we were both in New York together, and it was really watching the AIDS epidemic emerge that changed my thinking about what I wanted to do. I also mistakenly, going back to the obstetrician comment, thought that I was going to first do a residency in internal medicine and then do OBGYN and then reproductive endocrinology. That was my idea.
Still, we're going for that obstetrician.
But yeah, one residency was enough.
So it was the AIDS epidemic that turned you from potentially a traditional academic medical path to a path that involved a great deal of policy making. Can you talk about that transition?
Well, it was an extraordinary time because it was during my medical school training that we watched the AIDS epidemic emerge. And, you know, first we got the lecture, you know, literally as freshmen, that the future of medicine was going to be chronic disease because of the advent of antibiotics and vaccines. And then we watched this disease unfold, and, you know, I remember, you know, people didn't know the cause, certainly didn't know how to treat it, but, you know, we called it 4-H syndrome and GRID syndrome, and then, you know, we began to really be sure that it was infectious, but the organism hadn't, you know, yet been identified, and then, so, you know, watching that emerge, and especially, you know, the striking fact that it was affecting young, previously healthy people for the most part, too. Then, as medical residents and interns in New York City, you know, we took care of a lot of HIV/AIDS patients and had nothing to offer medically except supportive care. I don't think we ever got a patient off a respirator with pneumocystis pneumonia. And I just felt, but yet it was causing huge upheavals in society, and there was a set of legal, ethical, social issues that were, you know, very fraught. And I felt like I really want to understand about the bigger picture in which medical practice occurs. I want to work at the intersection, or at least explore the intersection of medicine with a broader set of issues. And so I was very fortunate. I talked to a lot of people about, different kinds of options, and it was actually the then Surgeon General Koop, who I had the opportunity to go meet with, and he recommended a position in the public health service.
He was a Penn person, by the way.
Is that right? I guess I knew that. I knew
that
that.
in the mix.
Yes. So I ended up working. I thought I was going to go down for just a couple years to sort of learn about the world of policy, and you may or may not remember that Gordon Douglas, who was our chair of medicine, said to me, if you're not back in 2 years to do subspecialty training, you will have thrown away your entire medical career.
He said something very similar to me, but it was a little more pejorative. But.
Well, it was a great sense of vindication when many, many years later, he called me up and wanted advice on how to transfer out of academia into policy.
Right. No,
but
he went through.
He went through Merck. Yeah. But he was exploring different kinds of things. But I went down to do this, and I learned about a whole world that I really didn't know about before. We didn't learn about public health then in medical school or population health. I didn't know how the government functioned. Frankly, when I was at New York Hospital, the only thing I knew about the health department in New York City was how irritating they were, because they would call us up and wake us up in the middle of the night if, as interns, we finally got to sleep, to say we'd filled out the birth certificates wrong, either used the wrong color pen, but more importantly, an unacceptable cause of death. And at the time, I felt like, why can't I decide what the cause of death is? Why do I have to use your list of names? I didn't understand about the importance of vital statistics and vital records. I didn't understand about all the other things that actually the health department did as well. But going down to Washington, it really opened my eyes to a whole other world, and I really came to understand that while I loved my medical training and I liked many aspects of medical care, that I really felt I could make more of a difference in the world of policy, and it fulfilled a sense of mission and purpose for me, that has sustained me through what has been now a rather long career.
And just let me digress or sort of pause at that point. Was there a point then where you asked yourself, well, will I not be carrying a stethoscope in this path in my career? Is there still that point? Do you reflect on, the interface, the direct patient care interface with patients that you'd had prior to that?
Well, the glib answer is I only miss the hands-on when they call for a doctor on an airplane and nobody else responds, and I wish, that my skills were a little more up to date. I made the transition pretty early. I worked when I first went down to Washington, I worked in a free clinic, which was a pretty scary experience because, we got some pretty sick patients and didn't have a lot of depth on the bench. And I went from working in one office at the Public Health Service after a year to working at NIH as special assistant to Tony Fauci, who was sort of my hero at that time and remains one of my heroes. But the chance to work with him on HIV/AIDS issues was extraordinary. But then I saw some patients as part of clinical research. But when I went up to New York a few years later and became health commissioner, I could no longer take care of patients because I was on 24-hour call to the city. My great Aunt Winnie, who was sort of like a grandmother to me, was very upset. And she said to my father, why can't she be a real doctor? And he tried to sort of calm her down and say, well, she is still a real doctor, but now she's got 8 million patients. But she didn't buy it. She wanted me to be a real hands-on patient provider.
Mothers like
right.
Child doctor.
Yes.
The traditional child doctor. So, so now we're into the true policy phase of your career, the beginnings of that phase of your career. And what what were you finding? What was driving you with excitement, and what was intimidating? What was there bureaucracy that was blinding, or I'm not necessarily going for the negative. I'm just trying to get a sense of, as you now embarked on this phase in New York City, in Washington, then in New York City, what struck you?
Yeah. Well, the first, really big job where I was in the driver's seat as the leader was health commissioner in New York City, which was a job I had never expected to have, and it happened fairly early in my career. I was lucky in that I'd had the chance to work closely with Tony Fauci, as I said, first as his special assistant and then as assistant director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. But it was at a time when the politics and the policy issues infused the work even of an ivory tower like the NIH, the AIDS activists. Some of you may remember ACT UP. Were very much present, and I spent a lot of time working with different stakeholders and thinking about, how to bring government together with academic researchers to get the voice of the patients and the activists, and the pressures coming from politics and sometimes very different perceptions of what needed to be done. So when I got to New York City, I was perhaps better prepared than I might otherwise have been, but that was still extremely challenging. And working with city council, I thought that the experience of city council, which was sort of like a circus at times, I thought when I went into federal government, wow, it's going to really be different now that I'm going to be working with the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now it's going to be civilized and dignified and full of substance as well, but it turned out not to be quite that way. But I think that, it is a perilous interface between politics, medicine, science, sometimes. And I think, for most people that have never worked in government, that's the hardest part, that you're getting. There's so many conflicting priorities that are being shoved at you. There are so many different stakeholders that you have to answer to. And it's increasingly being done in a way that's quite transparent, which has pluses, but sometimes you feel like you're in a fishbowl. And over the course of my career, I also had the experience of seeing the media transform, which has made, I think, these public service jobs much, much harder. It used to be that there was a news cycle, and everybody could rest at night a little bit. Now, with 24-hour news cycles and blogs and Twitters and all of that, it's just a constant churn, and everyone moves very quickly to break the story. And that can be dangerous in an area where science and data, really has to drive decision-making. You get pushed to say things. You get pushed sometimes to get out in front of an issue when you really shouldn't. And it also means that some of the stories that get written and what gets communicated to the public also isn't as grounded in facts as well, because people are scrambling to be the first to get the story out. And also with the crunch that media is under now, you don't get the same expertise in reporters covering stories as well. So, not only are they pressured and you're pressured, but they also don't understand the background, they don't understand the science, they don't understand the complexity of the problem, and everything gets dumbed down, and that can be both frustrating and sometimes dangerous.
So I want to come back to that topic of data and science, and the tension between that and the press and the public and politics. But just before we get into that, just continuing the career progression, take us to when you were appointed commissioner of FDA, and you know, tell us how that evolved, and you know, was that the natural next step in your career? I don't know if that's the natural next step in anyone's career.
Yeah.
Ever, but.
I can tell you that being commissioner of the FDA was never a job on my bucket list. And if you had asked me 6 months before I was appointed in that job, I would have said, who would be crazy enough to take that job? I had worked with the FDA from various vantage points over the years. When I was health commissioner in New York City, it was sometimes around adulterated products, food safety issues, sometimes unapproved drugs that were being sold in bodegas and other places. When I was at NIH, early in my career, I worked with FDA, especially around some of the issues of how do you rapidly get experimental drugs to patients who have no other options. There was huge pressure on NIH at that time, and there was a lot of tension and conflict, and FDA had to sort of be dragged pushing and screaming to the table to think about new approaches. At that time, that was when we developed something that was then called the parallel track and now is called accelerated approval, which actually allows you to use biomarkers or surrogate endpoints in a clinical trial to approve a product before you actually can ascertain the impact on extending life or you know, reversal of certain aspects of a disease's natural history. And that was very important for HIV/AIDS, and it's been very important subsequently, but FDA was very reluctant. So I saw FDA at that time as a somewhat difficult bureaucracy. But I ended up with the job not because of my own sterling credentials or my driving desire to be FDA commissioner, but actually because there were two candidates for the job. One was viewed as the consumer candidate. The other was viewed as the industry candidate. There was infighting within the transition team and members of Congress weighing in, et cetera. And I later learned, I had no idea at the time, that it was Senator Kennedy who suggested, well, what about Peggy Hamburg? And so I had actually accepted, the honest truth is I'd accepted another job in the administration as the deputy in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. And I got a call saying, we'd like you to be FDA commissioner. And I said, well, I think we've missed a few conversations here. And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, nobody has really discussed FDA with me in any meaningful way. I'd had one conversation with the then nominee, Tom Daschle, for HHS secretary, where I had told him that I was really more interested in working in the White House, or maybe the State Department, because I had strong global health issues. And I said, you know, in fact, if I was going to come out, go back to a job in HHS, the only one I could imagine doing, because I'd want to stay in Washington, was FDA, because my kids were in school in Washington, didn't want to move. But I said it jokingly, and we didn't discuss it any further. But he must have remembered that too. But anyway, they gave me 24 hours to figure out if I wanted to be FDA commissioner. Meanwhile, the science advisor to the president, who runs the Office of Science and Technology Policy, called me and said, I've been told by the president that they want you at FDA, so I can no longer offer you the job. So I ended up at FDA. That's the way politics work. But my daughter, who was then in high school, but very shrewd even then, said to me, you know, you should do the FDA because it's a real job. And she was right. It was a real job. It was an extraordinary learning experience, an extraordinary opportunity to, I think, you know, have impact on issues that really matter to people every day. I gained a whole new appreciation and, in fact, reverence for the FDA as an agency of government. You know, people can bash it all they like, and it certainly gets a lot of that. I was told by one of the high-ranking officials at FDA soon after I got there, and I said, why does everyone hate the FDA? He said, well, it's because we move slowly and bleed profusely when hit, so we're an ideal target. But it was a hard job. You know, I felt like I was fighting for something every day, and someone was always mad at me and at the agency, no matter what decision we made. But on the other hand, I've never had a job where I really felt that I made such a difference. You know, the FDA, I didn't understand all the things it did, you know, even as I took over the job, but FDA regulates products that account for close to 25 cents of every dollar that consumers spend on products in this country. When I became, and products that really matter to people, you know, whether it's their food or their drugs or their pets, food and drugs, cosmetics, dietary supplements, things that emit radiation, you know, obviously drugs and vaccines and medical devices. And then I also took on the regulation of tobacco for the first time in history, and also soon after I became commissioner, a new law was passed modernizing food safety oversight for the first time in 60 years, moving from a reactive model of waiting until an outbreak occurs and scrambling to try to figure out the cause and address it, to a preventive approach, which appealed to me with my background in public health. So I had a richness of experience that was amazing, and I also learned a lot more about the complexity of working at that interface of politics, science, and medicine. And the thing I miss most, I must say now, is I didn't appreciate it at the time because I started quickly to take it for granted, but every day I got to work on cutting-edge science. It was extraordinary, with wonderful scientists and colleagues.
I'll make an editorial comment, which is, and hopefully those of you in the room that follow FDA activities would agree. I mean, during your tenure as commissioner, there was just, and I speak from pharmaceutical industry, from an investment point of view, as well as from an academic medical point of view, there were advances that really transformed the agency in ways that will last for generations, and they were enormously positive. And you know, I can say for the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, where they typically hated the FDA too, they don't hate the FDA now. They see it as a necessary process and not easy, but they see it as a place that's actually trying to get discovery into patients as opposed to trying to resist discovery.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that was interesting to me and where I think we did make progress was that partly because of getting beat up over the years, you know, there'd be a drug scandal of some, you know, scandal of some kind, meaning a safety problem that emerged that hadn't been initially recognized, or a food safety outbreak or something. You know, FDA, when I took it on, was really, they'd circled the wagons. Nobody wanted to stick their head out for fear it might get cut off, and there was a sense of you know, both caution and also wanting to sort of be separate from the stakeholders that we were working with. And my feeling was, you know, we really had to open up FDA, make it more transparent, that people don't trust you if they don't know why you're doing things, but if you can explain what you're doing and why, and really engage and create a sense of partnership, you can make a lot more progress. And one of the things I'm most proud of is really breaking down some of those barriers and coming to realize that everybody benefits when FDA actually views itself as a partner, and not just in terms of the goal of, you know, in the drug area, reviewing a product more quickly, but actually working together on the science. And that was something I actually learned at NIH in the early days of HIV/AIDS, when the academics, the clinical trial network leaders, NIH, NIAID leadership, the companies, and FDA all actually were around the table designing the studies and figuring out, you know, what questions needed to be asked, what were the best opportunities to really move quickly. And we discovered, we lost that sort of knowledge for a while, but we sort of refurbishing that model, we really are at a point now where if FDA is engaged early and in a continuing way, you can take literally years off the R&D process because the right studies get done in the context of what really needs to be addressed. And also, companies and academics can sometimes be more cautious than the FDA because they don't want to do studies that then won't meet criteria, and so they sometimes over-determined what needed to be done. And FDA actually, especially in the oncology area and gene therapy to some degree, which I know is important here, helped to sort of say, let's do the studies this way instead, and let's bring this kind of new data analytics to clinical trial design so that we can, in fact, be more efficient and more effective.
And there are endless metrics to demonstrate that that has been more efficient and more effective. Let me switch gears a little bit and come back to the data and science question. So you alluded to the sometimes challenge between the core science-based mission at FDA in deciding on appropriateness of commercialization of products for patients. But we're in an environment now, and we'll have maybe a separate few minutes on the current FDA, but we're in an environment now in Washington and maybe beyond Washington where science seems to be challenged by a lot of people, even people in significant, sophisticated positions, and almost as if there's some question about whether science is the way that we should decide about whether products are efficacious and safe. And what do you think about this environment?
Well, it worries me a great deal on many levels. I mean, I did train in science and actually spent several years doing bench research before I started medical school, and then doing clinical research, and then as a public health leader in New York City, and as an assistant secretary in the Clinton administration, and then of course at FDA, I was dedicated to the notion of data-driven decision-making, and always struggled to try to keep ideology at a distance from how we made decisions in all those different roles, in politics and political pressure, or industry interests for that matter. But it does feel different right now, strongly so in the US, although it's not unique to US, where we're seeing a questioning and a demeaning of experts and expertise, a questioning of science, a tendency to get very locked into a position, whether or not the data supports it, and it's not something that is easily redressable always by more information. I mean, I used to think it's just a question of well, if they really understand the facts. And I've seen this on both sides in terms of partisan politics. I mean, certainly you see it on some of the reproductive health issues in the world of medicine and climate change, more broadly in science, as sort of being more issues where ideology and politics of the right might cause people to be what some label as science deniers. But I think genetically engineered food and agriculture is sort of the liberal science denialism as well. So, but how do we, and it's a broader concern in the political discourse, I think, how do we get back to an era, or how do we move towards what I would say is the ideal of being able to take these complex and difficult issues and talk about them and really look at the evidence and weigh the evidence and make decisions on that basis. But it's a, in a era of alternative facts, or what some have started to call a post-truth era, you know, it's a bad thing for science. And just one other footnote there. I mean, I think as a scientific community, we have some real roles and responsibilities. One is that we have to make sure that we do the best science possible. And clearly, some of the challenges around reproducibility and, you know, and then at the very end of the spectrum, you know, outright scientific fraud. But you know, we have to do the best possible science that we can, and really recommit to the highest of standards. But I think, you know, scientists have a unique role to play in helping to ensure and advance science education, both supporting STEM education in the schools, which is absolutely essential, but in some of the communities where there, you know, really is evidence of this sort of demeaning of the value of science, it probably reflects that people have no appreciation of the role of science in their lives. They don't think that it takes scientific research to have an iPhone, for example. They don't think about the importance of the scientific research that goes into making sure that their loved one's cancer chemotherapy really works. And so I think the scientific community in their own personal communities also have to start, you know, just trying to engage the public about why science matters.
So I want to dwell on this just for another moment or so, and we'll have this part of the conversation just for another few minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. But, you know, just on a slightly humorous note, my wife, who's quite well-educated and intelligent and sophisticated, still insists on giving our children vitamin C when they're coming down with a cold. And the reason she insists is, I think, even in the post-truth era, the biggest problem with science competing with what some people consider common sense, and that is that you know, even very intelligent people around the world are often not educated in the scientific method, and they just don't see it that way. You know, my wife's reason for giving the kids vitamin C is that it works, because she observes it working. You know, and I've given up on that point. I've given up on that point.
Yeah.
So I guess my question, though, is it'll take forever and longer to educate the entire world or U.S. citizenry on the scientific method at the level maybe that most of the people in this room or all the people in this room have been educated. But even absent that, is there pressure? And does the pressure ever cause succumbing to an FDA commissioner or other policymakers, but let's maybe stay within the FDA at the moment, to approve things because people think they work, even though the data don't support in the traditional way that they work? I can think of one example that came really after your tenure in the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy area.
I was thinking about that too.
You know, where I'm pretty sure even the way FDA has described it since the approval of the first drug for Duchenne's in the US, that FDA didn't really think it worked, but it thought, I don't know. So how does that pressure happen? And you know,
Yeah. Well, there are sort of two different questions. The one about pressure can take you into very different places, and you know, there's some good stories to be told. The question about what do you do when you have a product that may have limited value, or the benefits are not clearly demonstrated, but patients have no other alternatives. Taking that last one, I mean, I was disturbed, I will be honest, with the approval of a particular drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy when the data wasn't adequate. You know, the company had been asked to do studies also that they hadn't done that might have enlightened. And the review team actually didn't think, and the advisory committee didn't think it should be approved. But that decision was overruled by the center director and then supported by the commissioner on the basis of a number of hopes, I would say, that this would make the drug more available to people who desperately wanted it. It could continue to be studied. The company would continue to do formal clinical trials, and at some point we would have more information. My preference, and it's easy to say when you're not in the role anymore, would have been to find a way to do an expanded access, compassionate use mechanism to make the product more available, but not give it an FDA approval, because I think an FDA approval should mean that it meets a set of data standards, and that doesn't mean that it has to be, I mean, people think that FDA is totally rigid in how it does an approval, and there have to be, 2 placebo-controlled randomized studies. Many people think those studies have to have been done in the US, or else it won't get approved. I mean, things have been approved with very small numbers and single-armed studies, but it does have to meet a standard. So, I think it was a one-off, but a lot of reasons why it was concerning, including take it from a disease that is, quite rare, like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, to a disease that is far more common, sadly, like Alzheimer's disease, where there is also a huge amount of pressure to find a product for people that are seeking, hope anywhere they can find it. But it would be very different if you were talking about, using that standard of evidence for approving a drug for a disease where you would have, millions of potential users, and also if it would be at the same high cost. That drug is actually costing some of these patients and their insurers up to $600,000 a year. You could break the bank. So I think there are a lot of implications, but my guess is that was really a one-off.
Yeah, I mean, let me make a quick comment there. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we'll open it up. This is really a question before my last question. I have the authority of the moderator,
right,
or something like that. So I hadn't really ever thought this before, but as we're sitting here, do you think, I do know a lot about that story. The company is Sarepta Pharmaceuticals that had that drug approved, and there was enormous pressure from families of patients with this illness. I think at the advisory committee they had hundreds or more than hundreds of people nearly protesting. I mean, it was really tense. Do you think this is totally a one-off, or do you think we might be in, this is sort of the era of the social network influencing
well, I was going to say, I mean, social media, when I was talking about the changes in the media, social media is another one, and it does create whole new pressures. It creates networks of advocates. It engages, members of Congress in different ways too, and that is challenging. I mean, my view is that you never have all the data that you need, and it's a huge challenge because you have to make decisions without all the data that you need. You also do have to, no drug is absolutely safe, and no drug is entirely effective. It's always a weighing of risks and benefits, and do the benefits outweigh the risks? But my feeling is that if you start to allow certain things to sway you too much, you just go completely off course. So science and data has to be your North Star. You have to, have that compass. But you also have to have some flexibility. We, in recent years, have undergone a period of enormous rethinking of how we do certain things at the FDA. I still sometimes say we. But in terms of, as I was talking about earlier, alternative clinical trial designs, accepting natural history data, using different kinds of biomarkers and surrogate endpoints, trying to find these expanded access strategies as well for people that really have no alternatives. But I really don't think that we want to be approving drugs based on who can mount, the most powerful Twitter campaign, or, who gives the most money to different members of Congress or political, parties. And I think we don't also want to enter a world where drugs are being approved using Yelp, which was one of the candidates that Trump was considering for FDA commissioner. It actually proposed something similar. You do some basic safety testing. If people aren't dropping dead, then you just make the drug available to whoever wants it, and they'll report back.
Hopefully, we're far from that. That leads me to my last question, which is, where's FDA today, and where do you see it in the near term, at least?
It gives me a great deal of pleasure and gratification to be able to say that the FDA, I think, is continuing its core mission. It has a commissioner who probably would never have been commissioner in a different administration because of being very tied to industry, which has always been, sort of off limits. But he cares about the agency. He knows the agency. He, as I said, I think embraces the mission of FDA as a science and data-driven regulatory agency with a public health mission. And he believes in science. So, FDA should operate as isolated from the pressures of politics as possible. I actually advocate that FDA should be an independent regulatory agency. It's embedded in the Department of Health and Human Services now, but most other major regulatory agencies like the SEC and the FTC and the FCC are actually independent, and I think FDA should be as well. Consumer Product Safety, which spun out of FDA, actually is an independent regulatory agency as well. But it should be an agency that has a lot of continuity. It also, as I mentioned before, can sometimes move slowly on certain things, and so I see things coming out of the FDA now that I worked on when I was commissioner.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'd like to involve the audience in questions and comments, and Kevin.
So you've had some enormous jobs, which I imagine it would be almost impossible to feel adequately prepared for. And I'm very curious, when you took the job as Commissioner of Health in New York City or became FDA Commissioner, what did you see as the most daunting challenges in terms of being prepared to take those jobs, and then how did you go about trying to surmount those challenges?
Yeah, well, I did feel for both jobs totally unprepared and terrified as I took them on, I will be honest. And I've never viewed myself as a particularly brave person either. But they were jobs where, really the sense of mission drove me. I would say that, one of the really big challenges when I started as New York City's health commissioner was that I was very young. I looked young, and
Still look young.
I'm a lot older now, but the miracles of modern science at least have prevented my hair from looking as gray as I think it probably is. I had never really been in the public eye before. I'd been at the knee of a master with Tony Fauci, but I had never been in the spotlight like that. And I'd also never run a big, complex organization. In New York City, what really, I think, made my tenure a success, and I was there for 6 years, and actually going back to the theme of doing the job as a professional, not as a political, to my astonishment, 3 years after having served Mayor Dinkins, a Democrat, in the role as health commissioner, Mayor Giuliani actually asked me to stay on as commissioner. And I actually had not been expecting that or wanting it because I just had my first child. That was a good excuse to have a longer maternity leave. But I thought it was also important, the recognition that the health commissioner is a professional job, and I stayed on. But now I can't remember what I was saying before. But that I had never run anything. But I came on board at a time of crisis at the health department and really for the city. It wasn't the worst fiscal crisis that the city had, but it was a significant one. And our agency, our department, was being faced with huge budget cuts, and in fact, budget cuts that weren't entirely feasible or, I might add, legal. But the prior health commissioner had sort of wanted to leave in the good graces of the mayor. He exited rather abruptly after being there for maybe a year. And he had put forward a budget that was absolutely untenable to the mayor. But the mayor and his budget office accepted it because, if the commissioner says you can make these cuts and doesn't appeal the budget that gets passed back after the initial submission, of course you take them. So I came on and did my homework, and I talked to some other health commissioners that knew the department better than I, because I'd actually only been there less than a year, and responsible for one area, not the whole department. And there's a board of health, and I met with them. But I came in not expecting the job or wanting the job of permanent commissioner, and I couldn't actually even have it if I'd wanted it because the city charter required you to have a master's of public health, which I didn't have. So I fought like the Dickens for the department, and I was successful in getting tens of millions of dollars back with the support of the mayor, I would say, because when I explained to him what the implications of some of the budget cuts were, like eliminating the immunization program and the school health program, a few other things, and I might also add TB clinics, because we were just on the cusp. We didn't actually fully understand how serious the problem of resurgence of TB and MDR TB was at the time. But he immediately supported, along with the general counsel for the city, giving me back about $20 million, and then we fought for more. So the department was incredibly supportive of me as commissioner because they saw me as someone that was dedicated to the department and not my own, ambition. And that sort of became the model that I used later on. You have a purpose. You can't want the job too much. If the job is about having it on your CV, you're going to get into trouble. You have to care about the mission. You have to know who you serve also. And for me, it was always, the public first, and also my professional community. I was much more concerned about whether, my peers in medicine and public health thought I was doing a good job than whether City Hall or the White House was happy with my job. The one other thing I'll say, and this goes back to our days as residents, there were some dark times when I was in both those leadership jobs, and where I felt, just things were imploding, and I could not see good outcomes. But my training as an intern really helped, because I would think back on those nights, and we trained in the pre-Bell Commission days when you would be on as an intern and there wouldn't be much backup, and feeling like you never get through the night, but somehow morning always came, and that experience actually made a difference to me, years, decades later.
Yes.
Susan Domchek, I direct something called the Vassar Center here at Penn, which works on inherited genetic susceptibility. And so I first thank you for your leadership. I was very involved in PARP inhibitors, and so under your leadership, there was a path to ready approval. My question for you, though, is related to genetic tests and the role of FDA in sort of approving these tests today. The FDA approved 23andMe, the Oshkosh panel for your people too.
Right.
And it's happening today. And so, before this was a direct-to-consumer test,
Right.
So where do you see that headed? I mean, it's a little bit of a slippery slope too. Patients ordering whatever they want for themselves.
Yeah. Well, it's a really complicated issue. And as you probably know, the 23andMe diagnostic in particular was controversial, but it also is a broader set of issues. There are a couple of things that make it challenging. One is, what is the appropriate role of both a regulator like FDA and a trusted, educated physician interlocutor in approving and communicating and ultimately acting on certain kinds of highly sensitive and complicated information. And I think, we as a society are really still trying to sort that out. And, one of the big shifts in my lifetime was around HIV tests, where in my early days, you couldn't do an HIV test without pre and post-test counseling, and it was a big deal. And when I was FDA commissioner, we actually approved a direct-to-consumer HIV test. So, that was like a huge transformation. And I think we're going through a transition in that realm as well. It gets even more complicated in terms of the new generation of genetic tests, and there will be more and more iterations. But for FDA, the historical model is, one disease, one diagnostic, and now you've got next generation sequencing, and you can have one test that actually can provide insights into a whole range of different clinical and disease conditions with varying levels of information about those tests. And so how do you assess that, and how do you make that information available in a responsible way? So, the answer is that I don't have an answer. There were hugely discordant views amongst various professionals as well as policymakers on the direct-to-consumer issue with genetic testing, with many believing that you were putting patients at risk getting information that they couldn't fully understand and wouldn't know how to act on. And then there were those who felt that it was totally patronizing of the FDA to try to withhold information from patients who wanted to know. There was my husband, who actually was a huge fan of 23andMe. He was very mad when FDA ultimately took an action. But his answer was, why don't you just require that everyone take a short course in statistics before they get their results from 23andMe, so they can interpret all the different tests that you get referred to? It happens that statistics is one of his specialty areas, so for him it didn't seem like a huge barrier. But I think that we are moving towards an era. It's not just genetic testing; it's all kinds of medical information where the public is demanding access to information. From the FDA point of view, I think that the issue has to be, what is the standard of confidence in the validity of that information, and then we have to work with the healthcare system to make sure that that consumers actually have access to the kind of trusted advice that they need. But at the present time, if a medical decision is going to be made based on the test, that there has to be a demonstration of analytic and clinical validity. We could talk for hours now. I mean, it leads you into LDTs and other things as well that I'm sure you know about, but I'm going to eat up all the time.
Yeah, I have a question about the FDA and off-label marketing.
Mm-hmm.
When you were the commissioner, was there concern in the FDA that the Supreme Court might throw out that regulation on the basis of free speech, and corporations have people and free speech? Is that why some of those cases
Yeah. You know, this is, I don't know if everybody understands this issue, but FDA regulates products for specific indications, but doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, so that, you know, physicians are free to treat patients with drugs off-label, and it occurs a huge amount in certain specialties, less in others. But the question then also becomes, can drug companies advertise off-label uses if they can point to some studies that demonstrate the value? And that has been being fought out in various fora, including the courts in recent years. FDA lost actually 2 cases that involved off-label advertising, and made the decision, working with HHS and Department of Justice, not to appeal for exactly the reasons that you said, that there was concern that you could move from a fairly narrow decision to something that would be more global, and that we didn't feel, you know, comfortable moving in that direction, and wanted to continue to work on another track, which was working more scientist to scientist and medical provider to medical provider, to try to figure out ways to both collect more information that would be meaningful about appropriate off-label use, but to loosen some of the restrictions that industry found particularly galling, without actually being moved to the point of enabling outright advertising, because then the question of what's an adequate clinical study becomes a huge issue. One of the concerns that I had, you know, some sympathy with was that if you are an industry scientist presenting at a scientific meeting and there's a discussion about a particular product and its value off-label, that if that was, you know, your company, you and your area of expertise, you couldn't participate in that discussion, because it might be interpreted as promoting off-label use. And so looking at things like that and trying to find a way to advance the discussion but keep it grounded in science and knowledge and what's best for the patient was what I was working on when I left. But this issue continues to swirl around. There are a lot of law firms that are making a lot of money in their advocacy. There will presumably be some other cases, and you know, I don't know how it will all unfold. But you know, to me, it circles back to this critical issue about we don't serve anyone if we don't know if a product actually works, under what conditions, and for who. And so the first responsibility is to get more information. And one of the things in an era of electronic health records and more patient and physician engagement with the FDA is we actually can learn a lot more about off-label use that's meaningful and useful and can affect, you know, regulatory approval than we currently do. And I think that is being worked on and might prove quite productive.
One more question. Look, we're going over, but I'm not going to keep her. They're so good, so we're going to keep going. It's okay.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm an education student here, and I'm curious, because of your knowledge and background in the intersection of public health and also policymaking in the health space, what do you see going forward as the role for policymaking and some of the drivers of health outcomes that aren't necessarily about drugs and pharmaceutical products, like the obesity epidemic, and how, you know, policy might go forward in that space?
Yeah. Well, I think one lesson that we still haven't learned as a nation is that prevention and population health really matters. You know, it's more part of the discussion, and there's more attention and more resources, but you look at what's currently happening to the CDC, for example, and their prevention budget is being devastated. And you look at what are the causes of significant morbidity and mortality in this country and frankly around the world, and a lot of it is being driven by so-called lifestyle issues, diet, lack of exercise, smoking, and a lot of outcomes in health are being driven by social determinants, often lack of integration of social services with medical services, et cetera. So we do need to step back, and we need to sort of look at the broader ecosystem, and we need to make sure that we're making investments that really matter for health. And we have to continue to find ways to actually act on knowledge that we have, because we actually know a lot that we're not implementing in terms of the importance of population health and prevention, about the importance of social determinants of health. And I think we also, in terms of how our healthcare system is structured, we still aren't always rewarding, the most appropriate behavior in practice.
Yes.
Public advertising of prescription medicine.
Well, all I can say is there are only 2 countries in the world that support it, the United States and New Zealand. I can't even understand how it's effective, because everyone I know hates it, but it obviously is successful for companies, or they wouldn't do it. I think it does create an environment that feels peculiar to me. Number one, I think patients get a distorted sense of the value of medications, and then they are very unhappy with their physicians if they can't get them. And it seems that when it's a drug that is really for a very special medical condition, if you're going to have that kind of advertising, I'd like to see more balance in terms of actual information about the underlying disease and how it should be managed, and not just the advertising with a very rapid, very small print display of risks and that kind of thing. It was a decision that was made, I think, in the 1990s, and it was a trade-off, as I understand it, for some other things. But I think that the commissioner who made that decision was probably at that difficult interface between politics and best practice, and someday we may look at it again.
Since I already exceeded the time budget by 25%, going on 30, we'll have 3 rapid-fire questions and 3
And I'll try to
rapid-fire
give
answers.
shorter answers.
So we have, I had, 1, 2, and there's one in the middle, so we'll do 1, 2, 3. You start first, sir, and we'll do quick.
A lot of what you've addressed includes the cost of visiting. And I wonder what your thoughts might be in terms of the rollout of a specialized court dealing with issues with regard to things that concern, again, scientific decisions regarding liability, for instance, or the frivolousness, or whether still a cap on frivolousness of lawsuits just brought for economic but not necessarily public health benefits.
Doing this in 30 seconds is going to be very impressive, Peggy.
He said a specialized court. I mean, there is such an array of different types of lawsuits when you're at a place like the FDA, or when I was in New York City. In fact, just a quick aside, I always called myself Peggy until I became health commissioner. I never, ever used my formal name. In fact, I don't even know if I knew how to spell it for a long time. But as soon as I started getting sued all the time, the lawyers said, you have to use your legal name. And then I professionally became Margaret Hamburg. You know, I don't know that you could have one single court for dealing with all of the lawsuits, because they're in so many different domains, so many different types of suits. There certainly are a lot of frivolous suits, and they take, again, you know, many different dimensions, whether it's, you know, people that might have been harmed by a drug, you know, suing the company, or a company suing another company because they want to extend their exclusivity rights. I mean, there's just lots of different kinds of things. But I do think one issue that has concerned me is that there used to be in the court system much more, and I'm not a lawyer, much more deference to scientific agencies around litigation on rules and regulations that were science-based. That, I think, is declining, and I think that's a worry because it reflects, again, opportunity for politics and other pressures to start to influence decision-making. And many of the scientific issues are really quite complex. And, you know, until we get a judiciary that has, you know, adequate scientific training, I think if you don't provide a certain level of deference. The Chevron case is what people always refer to. But if you don't provide that level of deference, I think, you know, we're going to end up with a lot of bad court decisions.
Thanks for a great discussion. You've talked a lot about the interface of science, medicine, and politics. Another tricky interface is that of safety, efficacy, and cost.
Indeed.
And so do you foresee the FDA having a role, could or should have a role in how cost will play into approvals and
We're getting a whole semester worth of courses.
Right, right. I think FDA has a critical role to play in our national goal of trying to reduce costs. I think some of it comes from much more efficient R&D, and as I mentioned, I really think that this stronger emphasis on partnership, early engagement, you know, can reduce the time and cost of clinical trials. I also think that standards for safety and efficacy at the end of the day really matter for appropriate payment, because, you know, we don't want to be in a position of expectations that someone is going to pay for a drug or other medical intervention that hasn't really been demonstrated to have benefit to the patient. And that's why I really think the standards do matter. And I think we're in a tough environment if you are asking if companies are charging high prices, but we don't actually know enough about safety and efficacy. But I don't think that FDA should be involved with pricing per se. You know, they have more than enough to do coming at this from a scientific and public health point of view. Having the expertise to do pricing as well, I think would be very challenging and would bog the agency down. There's only one regulatory agency in the world that is involved in pricing. That's in Italy. There are some similarities sometimes between our politics and Italy's, I guess, but I don't see us moving in that direction. But I think that, you know, we need to look at how FDA's work fits with reimbursement strategies. And also, we need to think about all of this at the front end, too, because we want to make sure that we continue to drive innovation and that there are people who want to continue to invest in developing products, but products that will have proven benefits that will be appropriately reimbursed and that our healthcare system can actually afford to make available to the people who need it.
And we will have a reception afterwards so we can continue the dialogue with Mitchell and Peggy. So last question, please.
I am Jennifer Chu. I was here in faculty for 31 years. I wish you a safe trip home. And changing the note, how would you define a software to be minor concern versus something higher? If the manufacturer says this minor concern, so how would you define it from?
Software you're talking about? Software in a medical device or?
In a
Yeah,
medical device?
yeah. Well, you probably are aware this has been an area also of some controversy and an area that will only continue to get more complicated. Understanding how the software works really matters because it ultimately affects whether the product works. How much you need to understand about the software and review and approve the software in and of itself relates to the role that the software plays in the ultimate use and application of the device, and certainly the disease condition or action that the device is engaged in. FDA really doesn't need to engage on whether the software works for something that's counting steps or even counting calories, but if it's software that is maintaining your internally implanted defibrillator, then it really matters. And also, the question, I know it appeared in an episode of Homeland, but the question of hacking into software to cause disruptive and negative effects is one that the FDA also needs to care about and look at. But there's an interesting tension now that's happening between the interest of Silicon Valley and software developers and device types and traditional FDA review, because when you develop just a software product, for a computer, it's a very different regulatory framework than when you're developing something that performs a vital medical function. And the Silicon Valley types can't understand why they have to follow the FDA when they're creating some of these devices. But the reason is that nexus creates a very serious issue in terms of making sure that the product works as it claims it works and works safely over time.
Thank you. Listen, I think you can see from this dialogue, how fortunate we have Peggy and Mitchell share it with us tonight. So on behalf of all the people inside this room and Penn Medicine, I want to thank them. Mitchell has been as I mentioned, a great supporter of Penn and Penn Medicine over the years. The 30 years that he's left, when he graduated from here, he's been funding innovation in medicine around the world, and we're just grateful to have his insights. And he, like Peggy, they showed the advantage of having this background in medical medicine and science to go both into the private and the public sector, because we're so much advantaged by, even in a world perhaps right now, my politics were given away, where they don't pay as much attention to what science can bring to bear on these great public issues. To have people like Peggy and Mitchell in the world that they're in is just a great advantage to Penn and to all of us. So I want to, Mitchell, in addition to creating this great professorship, and Peggy's, again, in the tradition of the wonderful speakers we've had. I must say, I love this format, the kind of the give and take in this. And Mitchell has also supported professorships at Penn in general and in Penn Medicine, so he's been a great supporter of Penn over these years. And then Peggy, I must say, having spent some time in public sector myself, I think that world is fraught with great challenge. And I think the fact you've done such an exemplary job in New York and several stints in D.C., we're there with Obamacare and the FDA. You've really been in the middle of these great issues of our time. So I think it's a real contribution that we can make with your dialogue today. But also I think most of us inside this room have spent most of our time inside great institutions like this. But I think it's also important that we have great leaders like them in the business and governmental world as well, because as we all know, we're so much shaped by what goes on in D.C. and on Wall Street. So having Mitchell and Peggy there is a great advantage to all of us. Now, so thank them, please. And we have a reception, and we got more dialogue with Mitchell and Peggy. So thank you all.
Thank you.